Have you ever wondered how you came to know the languages you speak? Maybe some of them you learned at school, but you most likely learned at least one language earlier than you can even remember. How did you do that? Have you ever wondered whether we process emojis the same way we process language? Have you ever noticed that in English, we say the plural of cat with an S, as in cats? But when we say the plural of dog, we use a z, as in dogs. Why is that? Welcome to the 4th series of Linguistically Aware, the podcast about all things linguistics. This year, we have a great lineup of interviews with linguists from all walks of life that will help answer these questions. We'll be breaking down what makes language unique and fascinating, from the sounds we make to the way we construct sentences. We'll also be hearing about how linguistics can be applied to the fields of medicine and curriculum development, whether emojis and gestures can be considered language, and so much more. You are listening to CJSW 90.9 FM, broadcasting out of Calgary, Alberta, at the University of Calgary campus radio station, located on Treaty 7 land. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. To kick us off in this first episode of this series, we have a special guest host, Jesse Weir. Jesse's a PhD student also in linguistics, but their research focuses on syntax, or how we build up and represent sentences in our minds. In this episode, Jesse sits down with Dr. Lyn Tieu, an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the French department, to talk about her research in linguistics. Dr. Tieu came to the University of Calgary to give a talk on her research on linguistic inferences beyond words. So, what was she looking at specifically? What does that mean, linguistic inferences beyond words? Well, she was looking at how people might make inferences, a seemingly language-related phenomenon, with non-linguistic input, like gestures, visual animations, and even emojis. Dr. Tieu tells us a little bit about how she got into linguistics and her career path in linguistics, as well as what she found in this super interesting research. Now, you might be wondering, when we say linguistic inferences beyond words, what do we mean by linguistic inferences? A couple examples might be something like implicatures and presuppositions. Essentially, linguistic inferences are something we do all the time, where we kind of fill in gaps of things that are left unsaid or not stated explicitly. To give the example of presuppositions or implicatures, like Dr. Tieu talks about, for example, a sentence like, "The King of France is bald," presupposes that there is a King of France. On the other hand, an implicature is something that is also not explicitly said, but is sort of suggested, perhaps. So, for example, if I were to say the sentence, "Some of the students passed the exam," you might take that to mean that some students definitely did not pass the exam, even though I didn't explicitly say it. What you're doing there is making some sort of linguistic inference, so you're filling in some gaps of knowledge that I didn't necessarily state explicitly. And Dr. Tieu's research focuses on just this, but in non-linguistic examples, such as gestures and emojis. In this episode, we'll hear about Dr. Tieu's journey from biology to linguistics that got her to her research career now, and how that's led her to this research on linguistic inferences beyond words.
So I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Lyn Tieu.
Hello.
Could you start by introducing yourself and telling us maybe a little bit about your background and how you got into linguistics as a career?
Sure. So I'm Lyn Tieu. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of French at the University of Toronto. I'm a linguistics researcher. I work on linguistic meaning in adults and kids. How did I get into linguistics? So I actually discovered linguistics somewhat randomly. I had no idea what linguistics was. I was halfway through my undergraduate program in human biology, and I was taking a French minor just to maintain my French. And one of the courses that I had to take was an intro to linguistics, and it changed me. It was life-changing. So I changed my programs completely. I started taking as many linguistics courses as I could. I just thought it was such a cool field of study because it was scientifically rigorous. It was very methodical, but at the same time, it left a lot of space for creativity and trying to come up with new ways of analyzing linguistic patterns.
Yeah, that's really cool coming from a science background. You hear lots of people like coming from like an adjacent arts type background, but
right.
you did like a big swing like that. That's
yes,
really cool.
Totally. Yeah.
So that gets into how you discovered linguistics, I guess. But is there something that you wish you knew about before you got into it? Like something you wish someone would have told you maybe?
I mean, I wish I had known about linguistics when I started my undergrad because I would have gone into it directly. And I think it's been happening for a few years, but I think linguists are trying to introduce linguistics earlier, even into schools at the primary and the secondary level. I think there are lots of benefits to studying linguistics. So as I said, like I was attracted to the fact that it is like scientifically rigorous. So you are trying to, you come up with hypotheses that you then try to test. Your empirical data is language. And so it's a very accessible data set. So it's a very easy way to teach students about linguistic inquiry, about hypothesis testing. So you can come up with, problem sets that even in kids in high school can do. So I kind of wish that I had learned about it in high school or even earlier.
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense coming from the science background that you like fit really nicely into an experimental approach too, because like conducting biological experiments versus coming here and doing language experience, it's kind of a natural transition in that way, I guess.
Yes, that's true. I initially started off, so in this intro to linguistics class, there was a section on syntax. It was theoretical syntax. There wasn't really any experimental component to it. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure people were doing experiments, but experiments are really de rigueur now. But at the time, in an intro to linguistics course, there wasn't really any experimental component, but I was really struck by the theoretical aspects of it. And then it was actually when I did graduate studies in linguistics, when I did my PhD in linguistics at the University of Connecticut, I took courses on child language acquisition. And that really interested me in how we can do experiments so we can come up with fun language games with kids that are really informative about how they interpret language and how they use language.
Okay, so you kind of fell in love with the science of the field first, and then the experiment stuff came after.
Yes, exactly.
Very cool. Okay, so from your website, I saw that you're obviously, as you mentioned, interested in the acquisition of linguistic meaning in young children. Could you share just a little bit about like the process that like what we know about acquisition right now, and some of the findings that your research has contributed to those, what we know about it, I guess?
So my research focuses on the acquisition of semantics and pragmatics. So I work mostly with kindergartners and preschoolers, so 4 and 5-year-olds, they're at an interesting stage linguistically because they're producing pretty grammatically complex sentences, I would say at the same level of complexity as adults are. But it's been shown in some studies that the way that they interpret sentences in certain contexts might not align with the way that adults interpret sentences. So I'm very interested in how kids develop the ability to make inferences from the things that they hear, for example. So this is what a lot of my research focuses on. It's when we hear a sentence in a particular context, we typically will enrich our interpretation of that sentence by adding inferences from things that we know about the speaker. Why did the speaker choose to use this expression instead of another expression? Knowledge about the context, knowledge about things that I've learned in the world about the things that we're talking about. So I use all these external bits of information to enrich my interpretation of a sentence such that it goes well beyond the literal content of the sentence. And so I'm very interested in how kids develop the ability to draw all of these linguistic inferences.
Okay, so you mentioned like this difference between pragmatics and semantics, and I know the difference between those, but can you kind of tease those apart? Like what does what would semantics offer to a discourse versus what would pragmatics offer to a discourse, for instance?
Okay, so I think this could actually be quite a loaded question depending on who you ask the question to. So for a long while, I think typically when you take a semantics course, right, what you are learning about is, so let's say you're interested in the meanings of sentences, right? You're interested in the truth conditions of those sentences. So what does it take for a sentence to be true? And you're typically looking at the literal meaning of the sentence, right? So if I say, I am talking on a podcast today, right? What does it take for this to be true? Well, I have to be here. There has to be a podcast, and I have to be talking on that podcast, right? So we're just talking about literal inferences, literal meanings. But sentences don't typically occur in isolation. They're usually, uttered in some context. And so there are all these other bits of information that we can draw from outside of the literal meaning of the sentence, such that we end up inferring things that are not even said. So for example, if Jesse, you're doing this podcast with me, but usually there are two people who are doing this podcast, and somebody asks, okay, so who's doing the podcast with Lyn today? Right? And the answer is Jesse's doing the podcast. We might infer from this answer that the other person who typically does a podcast is not going to be there, right? Even though that was not explicitly said, right? All that was asserted was that Jesse will be there. And yet we're able to infer this negation of this other alternative, which is somebody else would also be there. And so typically we would say like maybe that's more part of pragmatics. So we're enriching the meaning of the sentence by going beyond its literal content. But as I said, it's kind of a loaded question because so for certain phenomena, it's not always clear whether it should be taken care of by the semantics or by the pragmatics. So there are certain cases, certain phenomena where people will say, oh, it's entirely, you're just making inferences based off of contextual cues. You don't really need a semantic mechanism for doing it. Other people will try to incorporate it into the semantics. They'll say, well, there is actually, it's actually in the linguistic representation, and this is what is driving this inference that you're drawing. So this is why, I'm just adding that it's not necessarily clear-cut, this distinction between semantics and pragmatics.
Okay, so where does your belief of it fall then? If it's loaded and some people have a strong belief one way or the other, how do you view it?
Fair. That's a good question. So I think, so my research looks at various different kinds of linguistic inferences. So it might depend on the particular inference that we're talking about. So there's a very common inference that's studied in the developmental literature called a scalar implicature that happens when you have competition between alternative forms, right? So if you say, some of the horses jumped over the fence, you might infer that not all of the horses jumped over the fence. And this is because some and all they can enter into competition. So all is, all of the horses jumped over the fence. This is informationally stronger than saying that some of them jumped. So if it's true, you should use the stronger alternative. So when you hear the weaker alternative being used, you can actually be led to infer that the stronger alternative is false. And so there are pragmatic accounts of scalar implicatures, but there are also more linguistic, more grammatical accounts of scalar implicature. And so I think most of my studies have sort of assumed the grammatical account that there is something in the linguistic representation that accounts for how we're able to derive the scalar implicature. But to some extent, since I do experimental work, I do acquisition work, this assumption isn't necessarily necessary. Like, as in, I don't necessarily have to pick a side, right? What I'm interested in is whether kids are able to draw these inferences, and then, based on what we find in our experiments with kids and adults, we can come up with theoretical accounts to explain the data.
Yeah, that's kind of the advantage. You don't have to sit there in an armchair and pick a side, choose what you want to believe. You can just collect all of the data and say, well, this is what the data says, and either build your argument to support that or try to find ways to refute that.
Yeah, we can be led by the data. Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
You're listening to Linguistically Aware, broadcasting on CJSW 90.9 FM on Treaty 7 Lyn. Listen to this episode or any other episode of Linguistically Aware in full at cjsw.com or Apple Podcasts. Just search Linguistically Aware. If you'd like to learn more about linguistics at the University of Calgary, be sure to visit our website, calgarylinguistics.ca.
So your research talks a little bit about the meaning that we're extracting from things that people might not conventionally consider to be language, things like emoji or gesture. Can you talk a little bit about some of the information you're gathering from these extra linguistic things and what that might tell us about how we're able to bridge meaning in unexpected ways as well?
Right. So semanticists and people who are interested in formal analyses of meaning have studied what are called linguistic inferences, right? So the fact that when you hear a sentence, you will enrich it with other kinds of inferences beyond the literal content of the words in the sentence. And so what we've been testing recently, investigating recently, is whether expressions that are not typically considered words or part of language, like an emoji symbol or an abstract visual animation that shows up on the screen while you're reading a sentence, or an artificial sound effect that accompanies a sentence that you hear, what kinds of information might those non-linguistic objects contribute? And in particular, do they contribute the same kinds of information as linguistic inferences, standard linguistic inferences? So, for example, I had mentioned the definite determiner the, right? It carries this presupposition, right? So when you hear the office, right, you're going to infer that there is a unique salient office in the context, right? Can things like emoji trigger a presupposition? So how do we test for whether they trigger a presupposition? So we know from semantic studies of presupposition that they have this characteristic property of persisting even when you negate the sentence, right? So the example, I'm not sure if I gave it earlier, but the office is closed, right? Presupposes that there's a unique salient office in the context. The office is not closed, right? If I negate it, it still gives rise to the same presupposition, right? So what we can do is we can insert an emoji in a sentence, see whether people will draw and they'll integrate the meaning of the emoji into their interpretation of the sentence, and usually we'll use iconic elements. So these are things that resemble what they're trying to express, right? So if I say, for example, the egg will, and then like the emoji where the egg is hatching, right? You will probably interpret this as the egg will hatch, right? So because the emoji is iconic, you can grasp its meaning even if you haven't seen it in a linguistic context before, right? Then the test that we want to do to see whether this meaning can be presuppositional is to embed it or to add negation to the sentence and see if people can still access that inference, because that is the characteristic behavior that standard presuppositions usually show, as with the office is closed, the office is not closed. So what you can do is then negate the sentence. So the egg will not hatch emoji, right? And the question is, do you get this inference that at this moment, the egg is currently in an unhatched state, right? And what we find in our experiments is that people do. So they will draw an inference from an emoji symbol or from a sound effect or from a gesture or from a visual animation. And crucially, even when you add negation or even when you add other logical operators, they can still access the inference. And so this suggests that, in fact, the inferences that are being associated with these symbols are projective. They are projecting through negation, just like classical presuppositions do. And so that's quite striking, because presuppositions are an example of an inference where we've typically associated them with specific lexical items, right? So like the, for example, the example that I keep coming back to, we say that this uniqueness existence presupposition is rooted in the lexical meaning of the. Right? And so if emoji symbols and sound effects are not part of a vocabulary, then how are people able to associate them with a presupposition? Right? This is what is so striking about these findings.
Yeah. You mentioned in your answer there talking about giving the example of the egg hatching. So the egg is like a physical thing that is like the object of the verb, the thing that is hatching or not hatching. Right. There are other types of emojis, too, that incorporate like a verbal element, like, waving, for instance, or clapping. Right. Do you observe any sort of differences when testing those types compared to like action-y type verbs compared to like physical object type things?
So in another study, we've actually looked at action or emoji that can express actions, right? So as you said, like clapping, crying, laughing, waving. There's the writing emoji. So what we were trying to do there was to see whether emoji can trigger scalar implicatures, right? So if you see if you read the sentence, Mary will write emoji. Can this trigger the scalar implicature that Mary will write, but not a lot, right? And so what we see is in a context where you have you make the alternative salient, right? So if you say something like, "What is Mary going to do? Is she going to," and then a single write emoji, or is she going to, and then you have multiple write emojis to signify that she's going to write a lot. Then when you interpret the sentence, Mary will, and then single write emoji, people will actually infer from this that she will write, but not a lot, right? Which is interesting because that's not part of the explicit meaning of the sentence, right? All the sentence says is she will, and then a single emoji to represent writing. And yet people are making an inference about the quantity or the duration of writing that she's going to be doing. And so they are generating what is a scalar implicature, essentially. So you have this competition between the single emoji and the multiple emoji, and that is enough to generate this scalar implicature, which you would typically find with, so the example I gave earlier was the some, not all, right? So some competes with all. So when you hear some, you infer not all. And that's kind of what's happening here with the emoji, is you see a single emoji, and so you're going to infer not a lot from that.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that they're putting this like kind of quantity onto it as opposed to like any sort of like emphatic meaning. It's very cool that like we're using emoji and interpreting it in unexpected ways.
Yeah.
So what do you feel like your research, like what do you feel like is the significance of your research beyond just linguistics? Like, do you think this tells us anything about how humans interpret language and how we think?
So I think that there's this common misconception that things like emojis or things like gestures are just like a messy part of speech, or they make speech messy. They're not sophisticated and complex. But I think what we're seeing in our experiments is that people make quite complex choices in their choice of expressions, and that includes in the case of emojis, right? So some of our studies have shown that the way, or the semantic contribution, so what an emoji contributes to the meaning of a sentence that it modifies, depends on where it shows up in the sentence. And so people who are, say, sending a text message that contains an emoji, they are making complex choices about which emojis to choose and where to place them within a sentence, and that has consequences on meaning, on how the message gets interpreted. Right.
So kind of this idea that emojis might not just be like a supplemental thing, but might be a language in their own right, or like an addition to our lexicon that people might not consider.
Yeah, exactly. So there are some cases where emoji are making quite complex contributions to the interpretation of a sentence. So they're not just there to emphasize a particular aspect or to make the sentence look pretty. They actually have identifiable consequences on how the sentence will get interpreted.
Very cool. So just to end off on a bit of a fun question then, are there any like common myths in linguistics that you hear that kind of irk you and you'd want to debunk or something like that?
I think I'll give an example from my work with kids. So I think sometimes we have this conception that they are somehow less able or less better communicators than adults are, that they will say like get distracted while they're trying to produce speech, or that they're not paying attention. But in the experiments that I do with kids, when I'm playing these language games with them and I'm interacting with them, there are actually cases where the way that they respond to the task and the way that they're interpreting sentences actually shows that they are more focused or more laser focused on deriving certain interpretations compared to adults, which is kind of surprising, right? So there are studies where I've gone in with a particular hypothesis that a particular interpretation is going to be harder for kids to access compared to for adults, and then what I find is that actually kids are doing better than adults are doing, and I think it's because, and they do so with less hesitation. This is is also very surprising. So there are, so when I do acquisition of semantics experiments, some of the kinds of sentences that we're dealing with are pretty complex. So they'll have different logical operators, like they'll have negation and a conjunction, or negation and a disjunction, and they're pretty complex. And sometimes we're like, well, how are you supposed to interpret this? And kids, when they're presented with these sentences, they don't hesitate. They get an interpretation, they give an answer, and they're super confident in their answer. And so that's something that sort of struck me in a study that I was doing recently at a daycare, where the kids were actually responding very confidently and more clearly, in a more clear way compared to adults.
Yeah, so we can kind of learn a lot about the differences in how they're interpreting things and how they're doing things, as opposed to just assuming that they're going to be like adults but worse, like noticing like the patterns in what they are doing and like kind of inferring like a little bit about development from that.
Okay, so most of my studies now are with English speaking children. When I did my postdoc in Paris, I did work with French speaking children. But the kinds of research questions that I address in my studies, they're not really about cross-linguistic differences. And so I tend to, for practical purposes, just work with the population that I have available to me. That being said, I've worked on how kids interpret disjunction in French. This is while I was doing my postdoc in Paris. And now I'm collaborating with a researcher in Romania to look at how Romanian-speaking children interpret disjunction. And we're finding some interesting differences across languages. So it's definitely worth looking into cross-linguistic differences in development.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, thank you so much for coming in today. It was really great talking to you.
Thanks for having me. That was fun.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Linguistically Aware. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the fascinating world of linguistics. If you'd like to learn more about linguistics, please visit our website, calgarylinguistics.ca. Until next time, keep exploring the beauty of language.